Welcome to Conversations with Kay. I'm Kay Ryder. And every week I talk with Vermonters who are leaders in the fields of government, healthcare, education, the arts, and community life. My guest is Diane Snelling, and Diane is the chair of the Vermont Natural Resources Board. And welcome to our listeners on 99.3 FM. WBVT-LP. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you, Kay. It's so nice to be back.
Nice to have you. Now, how long have you chaired the Vermont Natural Resources Board?
I was first appointed by Governor Shumlin in March of 16, so about a year and a half.
Okay. Is the board independent of the Agency of Natural Resources?
Yes, the Natural Resources Board, which oversees Act 250, is an independent entity in government. We're very tiny. I say we're small but mighty.
How many people are on the board?
There are 4 people on the board, and we meet informally. They have delegated most of their responsibilities to me. So in the day-to-day, I am the board.
Okay. Well, that's a lot of responsibility.
It is a lot of responsibility.
Oh, absolutely. Now, what does Act 250 do?
It regulates land use and development, and it was first established in 1970 through an executive order by Governor Dean Davis. And in fact, my father served on that commission.
Your father, Richard Snelling?
Yes.
Well, he did a lot for the state of Vermont, that's for sure. Now, why did Vermont actually need Act 250? Why did Governor Davis decide this had to happen?
He was out on a tour. This is the story that I've been told. He was out on a tour of places in Vermont, and there was a lot of new building of second homes around Haystack Village, and there were not a lot of controls at that point in terms of how you did your septic and things like that. It was steep slopes, and he actually observed septic leaching to the surface.
Overflowing, right.
Yes,
yeah.
and was very distressed by that and said we need environmental control. And in fact, the first legislation was about environmental control.
Okay, now what are some of the areas affected by Act 250? I mean, wildlife habitat, things like that?
Well, there are certain things that trigger Act 250 jurisdiction, so it's not a flat kind of here's the rules. And when there is an Act 250 permit required, then you can get into an analysis by the Agency of Natural Resources about habitat protection and also about historic preservation.
So the board says to the agency, we have a problem here?
No.
No,
it's a permit, and in the process of that permit and reviewing all of the evidence of the situation and the circumstance, will this be positive development or will it have adverse impacts?
Okay, now there's been a lot of talk. By the way, I'm talking to Diane Snelling, who is the head of the board of the Vermont Natural Resources. And Diane's talking about Act 250. So there's been a lot of discussion about Act 250. It's been controversial, shall we say. Now, what areas were controversial, Diane?
Well, I think part of it is that a lot of people attribute to Act 250 any and all kinds of state permits. So I think a lot of the criticism is misunderstood as also being part of A&R and other permits that are necessary.
What's A&R?
Agency of Natural Resources.
Okay.
So that's where you have to get all your water permits and to meet the criteria of Act 250.
Okay. So is there any other things that are controversial besides, is the idea of it controversial?
I think for some people it is. You know, I think initially there were lots of discussions about property rights, but this is very much about the common good and not interfering with people's personal property rights. So
okay.
I think the idea is to create a Vermont that we all love and that continues to be follow traditional settlement patterns.
Okay. Do we have more trouble today, not in my backyard, than we used to have when it comes to development and
I think there's more development, so there's probably more of that, yes.
right, right. The more you have, the more
Yes,
there is.
yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Now, Act 250 is almost 50 years old, which is quite an accomplishment. It's time for change, is it? Are there new challenges today? More technology, more knowledge? What's up here?
Yes, to all of those. Well, I think that one of the things people should realize is Act 250 has been amended many times by the legislature, so it's not as if it is static and is the same exact law as it was in 1970. It's changed. And I just read an article that says the definition of development has been amended 29 times. And that makes me think, you know, that each legislative session, there's an opportunity to do something for some other purpose. And so Act 250 has been used in lots of ways for other policy reforms. So, but we are adapting to the criteria, including climate change, and how can we better prepare ourselves?
Well, now, as Helen really used to say when she was a state senator in Vermont, we've been tweaking things.
Yes.
So perhaps now it's time, after almost 50 years, to look at it again. And I have read that the Vermont legislature has set up a study commission to review Act 250 and make recommendations to improve the law. And you just mentioned climate change, something you're going to look at. That wasn't a big deal 50 years ago, but it's such a huge thing, climate change.
Yes.
Now, how do you think you'll go about that, Diane?
Well, I think, you know, first of all, the governor has just appointed a climate change commission, and they're coming up with concrete action steps by December. So we'll have the benefit of that. The commission itself is 6 legislators, 3 representatives and 3 senators, and then there are 15 advisors who will work with the commission.
This is a commission to look at Act 250.
Yes,
Right.
Yes,
Yep.
the commission on Act 250 the next 50 years.
Yeah.
So one of the questions is about climate change and how could we make the criteria better suit what the changes will be. And one of the things that I've had discussions with people about is how do we move greater concentrations of villages and downtowns away from the rivers? Because obviously when we have extreme weather events, it is the rivers that overflowed, et cetera, and we get the floodways and the problems with erosion under buildings, et cetera. So that's something that everybody's pretty conscious of. I think there are lots of other things that are going to happen in climate change, just migration of different animals, changes in habitat, all of those things, you know, are terrible but necessary to consider.
Yes. Now, it's not only the rivers that people like to build by, it's Lake Champlain.
Yes.
And you know, we have had bad flooding on Lake Champlain also. You know, people like to live near water.
Yes.
And so this, how do you deal with this? If somebody's house is gone or somebody's house is badly flooded, they don't build there again, or what happens?
You know, I'm not an expert on that. I think that's more about insurance and how you prepare knowing that you could be flooded and whether you have flood insurance or not. But certainly the towns and municipalities are trying to encourage people not to. And if you recall, I was on the show talking about shoreland protection a number of years ago. And I think that makes a big difference also, just not building right down to the edge and making sure that there's shade for the fish in the biota.
Right. Well, climate change itself is a scary thing, I think.
Yes, it is.
And it's such a huge issue, and I'm certainly glad that the commission is going to try to work this in. And also the concept of what you call core development. What do you mean by that?
I'm sorry.
What do you mean by core development?
I don't.
Core development, building in one area.
Designated centers.
Yes,
we talk about,
which
is a process that a village or a downtown can go through to be certified as a designated center for development, and then you get certain provisions that help you do that. You could possibly then apply for grants to do upgrades to facades and things like that, improve sidewalks and.
Right. Now, but sometimes the towns themselves, like Charlotte, didn't want sidewalks. I mean, people in the towns decide that they don't want certain things, which would make an area better for development.
Yeah, well, the towns have to decide that they want to participate. This isn't anything anybody's forced into in terms of designated centers. But I think Vermont has always been made up of fairly dense villages and long stretches of rural fields and forests in between. And what we have to do is really protect that rural place also. We want the development and economic growth that comes with building in the designated downtowns, but we also want to know what we have to do to protect that rural places.
I'm talking with Diane Snelling. She's the chair of the board of Vermont Natural Resources. But you have, yes, it used to be that way. But now when you drive along from one town to another along a road in Vermont, there's very little space left between some of these downtowns and this growth area, if you will.
I would say mostly in Chittenden County, Kay.
Oh, right.
I think Chittenden County is a little bit different than the rest of Vermont, and we're all constantly reminded of that if we had the economic engine that Chittenden County is in more parts of the state, we wouldn't have a problem. But people want to build because the market is in Chittenden County, and so it's also the place where we need the most housing. And I think some of the development we've seen is primarily housing, which we need desperately. So part of the things that we see are a combination of what the towns want and what the state prescribes.
Right. Now, when you have this permit process, and this has been very controversial, and I assume that the commission's going to really look at this one, Diane.
Okay, a permit for?
For permits, what kind of permits does Act 250 deal with?
It allows you to build a certain kind of development and a certain amount of, it has a relationship to whether the town has zoning and bylaws or not, and if not, then there's a smaller area that triggers the jurisdiction. And it simply allows you to build your project, and it guarantees or tries to guarantee that you don't have any problem with drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, wetlands, protected habitat areas, things like that. So it's trying to make sure that all of the potential adverse impacts are resolved and there are conditions given to make sure that those adverse impacts don't happen.
So for instance, if someone wants to build a big shopping center in some town, you look at these, look at these look at these things that could be problems. And if somebody wants to start a business, same thing, right?
Well, of course, depending whether you're building something to start a business. I mean, you can start a business without building a building, but if you're building a large building, yes, you would need a permit.
But if you go into a building that is sitting there, and it used to be maybe a great big warehouse or something, and now you're going to start a business there of some kind, then do you get involved at all?
If it had an Act 250 permit, then you would need an amendment. If there was no underlying, as we say, Act 250 permit, then you probably wouldn't need one.
Okay, so these permits, as I understand it, it takes a long time.
Well, this is something people have said since the beginning of Act 250, and one of the things that I've discovered is that the same criticisms that I hear now were the same from the beginning. So I find that fascinating. We process a majority of permits in under 60 days. And a lot of people have old stories of bad experiences, and they get told over and over and over again. And we have no way to really educate the rest of the public about all the other aspects that go into getting an Act 250 permit, which is you need to get all of your A&R permits, you need to get state letters of acceptance of a particular project. So there are things that impact how fast we process that we have no control over. So I would say it doesn't take too long. It takes the right amount of time. Can we try to speed it up? Yes, we're trying to make it much more consistent and predictable.
Okay, now you're saying that to some extent you have, instead of old wives' tales, you have old Act 250 tales that
I think
people go back to.
Yeah, I think people had some very disturbing and distressing experiences with Act 250, and that's very memorable. It's very rare that you get somebody who says, wasn't it wonderful? Despite the fact that it was, you know, and that the development itself is better for having gone through Act 250.
Right, right. Well, I'm talking with Diane Snelling, who's chair of the board of Vermont Natural Resources. We're talking about Act 250. So this can be improved, this permit, but I'm fascinated. 60 days? I mean, that's not too bad.
No.
No, not bad. Now, are you involved, say somebody, like in Burlington, where they want to put up the great big city center there, and some citizens sue? Now, do you get involved then?
Well, we had to issue a jurisdictional opinion, which is when you need to know whether a project will trigger Act 250 or not. You ask the district coordinator. We have 9 districts and 9 district commissions, and those commissions are the ones that issue the permits. The district coordinators are the staff of the Natural Resources Board, and they facilitate processing of the permits. So we got involved to the extent that we needed a district coordinator needed to issue a jurisdictional opinion as to whether that project qualified for a priority housing priority housing project, which entitled it not to go through Act 250. So to some extent, yes, we were involved, but we weren't engaged in that particular appeal.
Okay. Have you been involved in the EB5
No.
issues? No. Well, that's too bad. I mean, I'm astounded.
That we were involved in one project expansion that I'm aware of. There may have been other things, but we did not have any problems that I'm aware of.
Okay, all right. What about you know, well, we talk about the towns and the rural areas in between. Are you involved with residential building?
If it's a multi-lot subdivision, yes.
Okay.
So over 10 lots triggers Act 250 jurisdiction.
Okay. So if some farmer is going out of business and he or she wants to sell property, they sell 9 lots, then you don't get in there, right?
That's right. And that's one of my concerns, is that's quite a bit of development without oversight.
Yeah.
I just want to mention one other thing, because it's becoming very popular, is if you have a large barn on your property, you renovate it and then have wedding events. And people should understand that that does not fit the exemption of farming, and that it becomes a commercial enterprise, and they need an Act 250 permit.
Now that's interesting, because a lot of barns in Vermont are, you know, Vermont's a big wedding state. Oh my, yes.
And I would like to work on that with the legislature, with the Act 250 Commission, to see what we can do, because there's also a lot of pressure for different kinds of economic development in rural areas, and that strikes me as something that is a possibility for farmers or others, is to have events, and so I think we need to work on that.
Yeah, that'll bring money into the towns.
Yes.
I mean, this is a good thing. This is a good thing.
It is.
Yeah. Plus, if you're selling Vermont products, Vermont-made products in your barn, again.
If you're selling Vermont-made products, then you might qualify as a farm stand. The difference. I know. There are details, Kay.
Right, absolutely, yes. Everything's complicated, Diane.
Well, I don't know that it's complicated, but there are details.
Oh, absolutely. The devil is in the details, they always say, don't they?
No, I always say God is in the details.
Oh, good for you.
Because Mies van der Rohe said that, and I appreciated his architecture.
Oh, yeah, right. That's interesting. That's very good. I like that. So are you a member of the commission?
I'm an advisor, so I'm not actually on the commission. The commission is only legislators, but I'm an advisor. There are 15 advisors.
Okay. And you have people on this commission really from all over the state. Yeah. Where are they from?
Well, the three senators are Chris Pearson from Burlington, Brian Campion from Bennington, and Dick McCormick from
That's okay. That's okay. I'm sure he
Windsor.
won't get. There you go.
Windsor.
There you go.
And the representatives are Representative Sheldon from Middlebury, Representative Dean from, and I'm sorry I don't know his exact town, but it's by the Connecticut River, and Representative Paul LaFave from Northeast Kingdom.
Okay, well, we've hit all the bases then.
I think it's a good commission.
Yep. Yep. Good. Good. Do you feel that this study commission is the best way to go at trying to improve Act 250?
I do, and I encouraged this legislation because I felt it was appropriate at this time to really take a step back and look at how is Act 250 working? Is it achieving the outcomes that we want? Are we happy with where we live? Do we have, things that we want to make sure we have in the future? And I think there are many. And what had started happening is each year there would be some little change here, there, and everywhere, and it kind of has muddled the goals. And so I think this is an opportunity to really look carefully and thoughtfully at those goals and make whatever small adjustments need to be made to make it easier to apply and get your permit, but also more protective of the environment.
Right. Now, will you write a report?
Yes.
Yes.
The commission writes the report.
Right. When is it due?
In December of 2018.
Okay. So until then, we're operating on the same rules we have now.
Yes, yes.
Okay, yeah.
No, until we change statute, there's no change.
Right, okay. Now, part of this, I would assume, I read an article maybe a couple weeks ago about losing forest land every day.
1,500 acres. There was recently a study released. Bill Keaton from University of Vermont has been studying forest, and 1,500 acres of forest were lost in Vermont. And I think he said something like 25,000 in the Northeast states, which is pretty incredible. And I think most of that is subdivision of forest lands. Part of the problem right now is that if you own large tracts of forest land, how do you make money from that? And the market has changed significantly. Maine and New Hampshire are doing a lot less wood processing, et cetera. So trying to figure out what the balance is between allowing those people to make money from their land, but also making sure that we maintain forests.
Okay, we all love our forests. I'm talking with Diane Snelling, who chair of the board of the Vermont Natural Resources Committee. Diane, do you think that I would say that some people think they've had big problems with Act 250, but do you think in general that the Vermonters support Act 250?
I do. I don't have any official statistics yet. I'm working on that. I do hope to be able to quantify it. But I think that more people would support Act 250 if they knew that it was partially responsible for the way Vermont looks. Obviously we started with a beautiful state, and I think what Act 250 has done is help keep it a beautiful state.
Right. You never get stats on what didn't happen.
Right.
That's part of the problem. Yeah.
And it's hard to see what's better by having gone through the process. Yeah.
Right. Right. Now, Vermont needs good-paying jobs.
Yes.
And many young workers leave the state because they can't find jobs. And yet we want to keep Vermont green and beautiful. Can we do both of these things? Have economic growth and still keep our state? Do you think so?
I think we have to. I think it's absolutely necessary. If we lose a clean environment, we have nothing to market. We have no difference between any other state. There's a quote of my father's that's something like, if the prize is gone, the struggle loses meaning. The Vermont environment is the prize.
Aha.
And I think the issue is that if you focus too much on economic development and lose your environment, you don't have anything. Act 250 is very supportive of Vermont's quality of life and contributes significantly to the quality of life. And I think that's why people want to come here and live here and work here. and we have to figure out how to better market that environment to people so that we're not trying to say, well, in these times we need to do these things that further subtract from our environment.
Okay. Why did you want to chair the Vermont Natural Resources Board? Why did you want to do it?
I have always loved Act 250. I could say I'm very passionate about Act 250, and I was in the Senate when I served on the Natural Resources Committee, and was always very interested and tried very hard to make sure that damage wasn't done to the process of Act 250. And so it seemed to me like a natural thing to want to do. I knew it would be a challenge. I knew that the reputation needed some improvement, but I like a challenge.
Right.
So,
right. I know that. I've talked with
yes.
you long enough to know that.
Yeah.
And so I won't ask you about wind power today because I feel that wind power is a great thing for the environment.
The problem is only installing it.
We've gone round and round about this. So you love Vermont.
I do. I love Vermont.
Its beauty.
Yes, absolutely. You know, I learned from an early age about how different Vermont is from many places, and how valuable it is that Vermonters have easy access to gorgeous forests and meadows and all of the rest of it that we appreciate so much. We have fabulous views that are protected in many cases, and I hope more will be. So yes, it's a wonderful place to live. It's a great scale. You know, I know we need more people, but I kind of like this amount.
Oh my, we won't go into that.
Okay, no, I'm just saying, you know, it's hard to say whether Vermont is wonderful because of its scale. If we had 3 million people, it would look very different. That's all I'm trying to say.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. Well, thank you for coming, Diane.
Thank you.
Carry
Kay.
on, and I hope you have a successful commission. And thank you for joining us on Conversations with Kay.